Hey, everybody. I appreciate everybody for coming today. I know I announced this at the kind of the last minute. So I do appreciate for folks that uh, were jumping on. Hopefully, everybody can hear me. I'm going to also share my screen so that way there's a little bit more to look at and just me, myself, and I. So I want to make sure everything lines up. All right, good. I think it's all there. I just want to also make sure the that in the right window, and then pull up the chat as well. I know it's not going to behave nice today, is it? All right, we'll uh, we'll do this. So again, I appreciate everybody for coming, especially again announced at the last minute. I do want to start doing these every Tuesday at noon. I think next week I'm actually presenting at a conference from 11:30 to 12:30, so that kind of uh, doesn't necessarily work out, but hopefully after that, and minus the upcoming holidays, especially in the U.S., that do want to keep these two Tuesdays at noon and just kind of keep them rolling. So appreciate again everybody for being here. I'll keep an eye. I'll just jump back and forth between the slides and the chat just to see if there's any questions. So if you have questions, just drop them in the comments, which and we'll look at those. So I appreciate that. I did want to take a couple maybe steps back because I did want to focus on the top five critical or the top five controls as I see them for OT or ICS cybersecurity. There's definitely a lot of overlap with the SANS, top five critical controls. Though I do focus on the controls that will help any environment, no matter how much money they have. With the SANS critical controls, with the network security monitoring being one of those controls, which I feel is absolutely necessary in environments. The reality is that most environments aren't going to be able to afford to do network security monitoring. They can't afford the software, they can't afford the hardware, they can't afford the personnel. And I really admire, Rob Lee and the Dragos team making their platform available for free from a software perspective. That's absolutely amazing. Unfortunately, right, a lot of people still can't, for utilities under 100 million in reoccurring revenue every year. A lot of unfortunately environments just can't take control over that because even if the software is free, they have to pay for hardware and the people to install, configure, and monitor. And it's a lot of resources that they just don't have, and they never will, un- unfortunately. So, but I did want to take a couple steps back, and of course I like this picture in thinking of the Frosty Goop attack that we saw in early 2024. And this is where the Russian adversaries had used a very simple piece of malware to disable heating in 600 apartment buildings for 2 days. And that was 600 apartment buildings, not 600 apartments. Now that would be one thing, but 600 apartment buildings, right? It's very different, right? It's definitely a much higher level of impact to the community, and not having heating in the middle of a Ukraine winter with sub-zero temperatures outside. I can only imagine the the frustration, the anxiety, especially if you had little kids, right, and you didn't have heat. They still have power, right, but they didn't have the central heating available to them through the apartment. So always that just man, I just trying to put myself in their shoes, right, and imagine how that would have felt. But I also like to focus on this because, as far as we know, it's an incident where nobody died, thankfully, right? But I'm sure there were quite a few, people, especially vulnerable citizens like older, adult senior citizens that could have had health issues because of this. But you know, hopefully nobody died because of the event, but there was a significant impact that we could see, and at the same time, it was a very simple attack, right? So it actually showed that very simple attacks could lead to significant impacts. Right? Talk about the Trisis event, or sometimes people say Trident, from 2017, where Russian state adversaries had gotten into a petrochemical facility and essentially had taken control over the entire facility, including the safety instrumented systems, or the SIS, which is the fail-safe backup for the facility. So if there's ever a fault condition, or some type of issue detected that would cause a safety issue, right? It shuts the plant, or at least part of the plant, down safely, so that there isn't something like an explosion that occurs. And with Trisis or Trident, that was where the attackers had full control over the entire network, including the SIS. But they had made one little programming error, which caused the SIS to trip, and that's how the operators of the facility knew, oh, something's wrong. And they called in the vendor. The vendor comes out and looks at it and says, "Ooh, this is not us. You need to bring somebody else in." And so the operators, brought in their own folks. They brought in Mandiant. Dragos, came into the picture after that, and starting to understand what the malicious firmware did that was uploaded to the SIS. And so fast forward into 2024, and this was something that Rob Lee had shared at B-Sides ICS this year, was that there was a petrochemical facility in the United States last year in 2024 where there was an explosion. And just prior to that explosion, that Dragos had been tracking the same state adversary groups as Handworm that had created the Trisis incident. And so the same adversary group was spending 6 weeks trying to break into this petrochemical facility that had an explosion last year. And not only did they watch Sandworm trying to break into this facility prior to the explosion, but when the explosion occurred, the CEO came out and said that the reason for the explosion was that the SIS tripped, which is just very eerily similar, has some similarities to the Trident event and the Trisis event in 2017. Now the CEO also came out and said, well, there's no sign that it's a cyber attack. But you have to remember, in this environment, that they weren't doing any network security monitoring or any security monitoring. That gets really to the heart of the conversation. We talk about in OT or ICS environments not being able to do root cause analysis. So when something bad doesn't happen, or when something bad does happen, whether it's an explosion or you just have a pump fail, right, or a PLC goes on the fritz, like, do you have the data that you need and the people to interpret the data, right? To understand, right? To do the root cause analysis to determine, is this a cyber attack or is this something else? Because in the OT world, of course, 99% plus of the percent of the time, right, it's not a cyber attack. It's some type of operational issue. And that happens. But we have to be in a position where we can do the root cause analysis. So we know, is this a cyber attack or not? Because, yeah, looking at that petrochemical facility explosion last year, right? There's a lot of circumstantial evidence that says it could be. Even the CEO comes out and says, well, it's not, because we don't have any sign that's a cyber attack. But again, that's very misleading, considering you weren't doing any network security monitoring, which unfortunately is most of OT and ICS environments around the world. But it does make you start to wonder. And of course, lately I've been talking a lot about Jaguar Land Rover. And when we see JLR and the outages, right, where they had the vast majority of their global factories down, for 4 or 5 weeks before they started to bring them back online, right? They were just bringing online the first factory that was used for making engines, and then starting to bring on other factories. And some factories, right, they would just bring on one manufacturing line, so they weren't even up to 100% production capability. And there are still some factories that fire, are still down. And so there were obviously a lot of massive cybersecurity failures in the JLR instance. But a lot of when I look at these types of incidents, right, and kind of goes back to Rob Lee, and I was actually taking his grid course through SANS back in 2017 when Trisis was happening. And one of the reasons why I love that course so much is this idea that a lot of people think, right, that defending OT and ICS environments is very complicated and so much more complicated than IT. And in all reality, it's actually the reverse. So it's actually a much more straightforward. It's much more simpler. You can take a much more practical approach to protecting OT ICS environments. So we need to stop making it so easy for attackers to turn off the heating in 600 apartment buildings or gain access to the safety controls, right? The SIS of a petrochemical facility, or potentially cause an explosion, right? To have even just some type of impact. We can just even leave explosions out of the equation. Like looking at the impact of having all the global manufacturing plants down for a major auto manufacturer, to the point where there were 200,000 people at risk of losing their jobs. And that's 200,000 families without paychecks, right? That's where my mind immediately goes to. We need to stop making it so easy for the attackers. But again, it doesn't have to be hard or complicated either to defend OT or ICS environments. So I'm going to flip over just to see if there's any questions real quick. So if you have questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat. So I think I see one or two. Appreciate Jiao Hao Jiao. Oh, I need to work on. I'll have to look up how to pronounce that one because I'll butcher. My I'm horrible. My Spanish is bad. My Portuguese is even worse. So, Sergey, thanks for coming from all the way out from the Ukraine. So, F Russia is all I can say. So, we definitely keep you in our thoughts. Fernando, thanks for coming. So, LinkedIn user anonymous from Virginia. So we're practically neighbors. So I'll be up that way in a couple weeks. So Michaela from Denmark, I'll actually be out there next year. So I'm really excited about that. So Fabricio asked, "Is passive monitoring effective?" Yeah, absolutely. And it's good. I think there's two things to talk about there. And unfortunately, network security monitoring is not in my top five because, again, like I mentioned, I think at the beginning, is most OT or ICS environments, right? They just will never have the budgets or the resources to do network security monitoring, unfortunately, right? But for those that do, right, I mean, that's how you can get to that world class, mature OT cybersecurity program. And so when you're watching the network and what's going on, right, within the network, a couple things to keep in mind actually is a, right, you can do network security monitoring very similar to the IT world, right, where you're watching for anomalies and you're watching for, signature matches as well. But it's a lot easier if you're watching for anomalies in the OT network, which are much easier to spot than they are in the IT world. Now, in OT, you have to understand what those anomalies mean. Because again, most of the time, right, 99.9% of the time, when you get an alert, it's not an attacker that's in the environment. Right? It's some type of operational issue, right? I came across one once upon a time where there was essentially an OT SAM that was alerting because you had an HMI. If you're not familiar, that's the kind of GUI that shows us what's going on in the environment. And the PLC is what controls the process of what's going on in the environment. The PLC is controlled by that HMI, and so you had an HMI that all of a sudden started pulling data from a PLC, every second. When prior to that, it only pulled data once a minute. And so you went for years from an HMI pulling a PLC, like once a minute, to all of a sudden now it was just, or once a minute, to just this continual stream. It was like, what's going on? And it turned out, if you actually go and investigate, which you should when you get an alert, found that this PLC was in a cabinet, and that cabinet, the cabinet that had its vents, the vents were clogged with dust. And so, because all the vents were clogged with dust, the PLC temperature was heating up. And so it had broken a threshold. And the HMI was programmed that if the temperature of the PLC broke a certain threshold, then it would continue to pull just over and over and over and over and over continually, right? Trying to get attention. And so an operator, right, would get that attention ideally, but there was no alert ever programmed in that example. There was no alert program to let the operator know that the PLC was overheating, but they saw it on the sim where they could go and investigate and say, hey, why is this HMI now all of a sudden continually pulling? Again, it's a great example of, it's not a cyber attack, but it is an operational issue, and it's an anomaly that we can detect, right, in the environment. So we do, though, yeah, passive monitoring is great, because as long as there are some challenges with that, and one is also just making sure you get the visibility. Or sometimes I hear the horror stories of, you know some of the the larger environments where they say, oh, they have like 100 plants globally spread out of the world, and they say, oh, we implement like vendor X, YZ, to monitor our OT network, uh, and but they only have sensors deployed at, one location. So just enough to say, oh yes, we use this platform to watch the network, but they're only watching, such a small percentage. And even if you just have one, plant, are you looking at the entire plant, or are you just looking at, a small portion? So when you are doing, network security monitoring, you want to make sure, yeah, you see everything, at least as much as you can afford to. So, and I get it, there are costs, but yeah, passive monitoring, right? Network security monitoring is one of the top, controls that I have, which is, the most important as far as, yeah, watching, for attackers. If we're not watching, how are we going to know the attackers are in the environment, right? But and Rob Leotragos, he's been highlighting probably for about the last year and a half or so that only about 5% of OT environments globally actually do network security monitoring. It really comes down to cost, I think, at the end of the day. So, but I could talk for another 40 hours on that. So, but yeah, hopefully that answers the question. There's a lot more to say. So, but Ranga Ringappa, thanks for coming. I appreciate it. So, Mike from Greenville, we're literally neighbors. So, Theodore, I'm not going to DIS this year. I'm kind of sad about it, actually, because I have a ton of friends at Dragos. They're all going to be there. It's always good to see Rob and Don and Jimmy and Sasha. I mean, and Kate. I mean, everybody. My my travel budget is completely shot though this year by like July. So I went 2 years ago. Had a great time. I suggest to everybody goes to DISC, even though it's more tailored for their clients and employees. But yeah. So John, that's an easy one. So, but yeah, have a great time at DISC. So I wish I could go. Definitely one of those fear of missing out FOMO moments for sure. So, well, Hamid, thanks for coming. So, uh, Jonas from Belgium, Nathaniel, welcome back. So yeah, we're just hanging out. So glad you made it. So thanks for stopping by. Yeah, I'm gonna try and do this every Tuesday at noon. So again, except for next week when I'm speaking at a conference actually from 11:30 to 12:30, I think, something like that. So, but thanks, Joel, for coming. I appreciate that. Yeah, yeah. Sandworm is a great book. So really talks, even though the book itself is, I think, what, 5 or 6 years old at this point. I'll have to look it up. I think it's 2018, 2019. But yeah, it really talking about Sandworm and the impact that they've had in OTICS, cybersecurity, and the IT world. You know, definitely, and I think it does a really great job. It's just a great story, right? You can read it as a novel, but helps you understand OT, ICS. Actually features you talking about Rob Lee in there, even though he wasn't interviewed for the book, which I find is absolutely kind of funny. So welcome, Fabrizio. So another couple more LinkedIn. If you're coming from LinkedIn on this screen, I just say LinkedIn user, unfortunately. Though there are a lot of people from LinkedIn. I see their names, and some it just says like anonymous LinkedIn user. I hate to say. So let me go ahead and jump back to the slides. Because and then I'll come back and check to see if there's any questions. But I do appreciate everybody for jumping on the session today. So we did talk about some of the more recent events like Jaguar Land Rover. It's now on my timeline, just because of the impact, right? And again, it's not even that you had attackers targeting OT, right? This is more the attackers targeting the IT environment. The entire IT environment burns down, and then you lose all of OT operations. And unfortunately, that is only going to increase because of the dependency of OT and on systems that are in the IT network. And we see that a lot of discussions right now, like in ports, like around maritime, because there's so much not only IT but AI going into ports, right, to manage things like moving containers on and off ships and on and off trucks, right? And what happens if you had an IT outage? A lot of people are also now asking, well, what happens if I have some of those systems in the cloud, right? And there was that big Amazon web service or AWS outage yesterday, right? That impacted a lot of different services. Actually, was doing an awareness call earlier, internally for my day job, and someone was asking, well, yeah, what about AWS and how do we protect against it? I'm like, you don't, right? It's if you're dependent on a service and it's in the cloud and that cloud goes down, you need a backup, right? You need a backup plan at least. But every environment is going to be compromised, just like every IT. And in this case, right, it wasn't even a cyber attack. It was just a DNS issue, right? Somebody made a mistake. So, but I did want to get at the heart of the presentation and go through these at a high level. And some of you might have seen me talk on these before, but these are my, top 5 controls that apply to every environment. And I realized like there's the SANS ICS top 5 critical controls. I love Rob and Tim to death, and they put those together. And when they put those together, their idea was they wanted the 5 controls that would help prevent like all of the OT ICS cybersecurity incidents that they knew of. And if there's anybody that knows as many as possible, it's those two, right? And so they do cover things like network security monitoring, which right is absolutely, you know, hits the nail on the head, right? Because yeah, network security monitoring is one of, if not the way, right? You're going to find an attacker in the environment before it's too late. But again, what I was mentioning earlier is that network security monitoring, right, is not going to be deployed at the vast majority of environments just due to cost. In my day job, I work in some of the largest OT or ICS environments in the world for some of the largest companies like Saudi Aramco and BP, Shell, right? They invest heavily in things like network security monitoring. Yeah, that's not a concern. They have it on lock. But the vast majority of OT ICS environments out there, and I do some site consulting, especially like in manufacturing, right? And there's still a lot of like small, medium-sized manufacturers that most will either never be able to afford things like network security monitoring, or some they're just starting their OT cybersecurity journey, right? So they just haven't got there yet because we need to nail the basics first. Because if you can nail the basics, you can reduce your risk the most. And the great thing about these is that they're the least expensive controls, right? Compared to, something like I always go to, like the very end, if you look at my top 20, the very last control is penetration testing, right? Will penetration testing help you find issues in the environment? Sure. So will it reduce your risk if you fix those issues? Sure. But is it going to find all of your issues? No. Right? It's going to find a few, maybe some important ones. Right? But it's not going to find all of your issues. And plus, pen testing, especially like true OT ICS pen testing, is really expensive. When I talk about something like secure network architecture and just making sure you have a firewall between IT and OT, go buy a couple $100 firewall, right? There's a big difference between pen testing and spending, 60, 70, $80,000 or more versus a couple $100 on a firewall, and that firewall is going to reduce the vast majority of your risk. Right? There's a big difference. So we talk about, yeah, the first thing, and I used to have backup and recovery on the list, but I moved it up the top two reasons. One is I would go into a lot of manufacturing plants that they didn't have backups for all their critical systems. So if they went down, they wouldn't be able to restore the actual manufacturing lines and get back up and running, just like we saw with Jaguar Land Rover. So you have to have your backups. You have to be able to test those, right, to make sure you can recover. Right? Asset management, understanding what we have in the environment so we can protect what's there. And also, I think for me, being an old network security monitoring person, right, is that, well, if we know we have, let's say, these 100 assets on the network, well, what if all of a sudden asset number 101 pops up? Like, where did that come from? Right? We had a plant one time as a power plant where one of the weekend operators brought brought in his Xbox because he thought he was going to, I don't know, have internet access from inside the control room. I still never found out what he was really thinking. I mean, I guess that's what he was thinking, but so yeah, obviously that wasn't good. But when asset number 101 pops up, well, we need to investigate and figure out what it is. So that's something also that can come from passive network monitoring. Right? Yeah, and secure network architecture. Let's have that firewall between IT and OT. That's the best way to protect your OT environment. The more you can limit, especially IT talking with OT. And I understand it's not possible in all environments, especially like manufacturing. But where you can, right, it reduces the vast majority of your risk. And then you do further segmentation within the OT network. So if an attacker does get into the OT network, which we have to assume will happen, then we limit what they can do from there. Of course, incident response, right? And this is the planning, right? Is making sure, do we understand where our risks are? Are we watching the news to see what's going on in other OT environments, especially ones like ours? Right? Like I work with one car part manufacturer, right? They can see what's going on with Jaguar and Land Rover, right? I don't have. It's nice in a way, right? Because I don't even have to, have that conversation with them, right? Any longer. They see how bad things can get, right? Because of IT ransomware. But that's part of incident response plan, and we'll come back and talk about all these. But and then vulnerability management. I've been doing IT security vulnerability management for 30 plus years. I remember when the original version of Nessus came out and used it, right? And then that carries over into OT, but vulnerability management in OT and ICS, right, is very different than in the IT world. And yeah, in like 2012, when I went to my first power plant, I would have been the person, right? I was the person being like, well, I didn't say it, but I was thinking like, oh, we need to, like update this PLC that hadn't been updated, and reboot it. And I'm like, yeah, no, that's not how it works. That's how you get people hurt or killed, or you take down the plant. Right. I heard there was a a podcast I was listening to like last week or the week before with some OT pen testers, and I mean, they admitted they had taken down a power plant, and they just kind of laughed it off. I was like, wow, yeah, like I would never want you, as a pen tester in any of my, you know, environments. Not that we would do pen testing in a live, power plant. So little concerning. But let me stop sharing real quick and jump back and see if we can see any questions. Looks like there's a few. So definitely a few more folks jumping in. So I really appreciate that. So Nazar, thanks for coming all the way from Uganda. So appreciate that. So LinkedIn from Jordan. My girlfriend, she loved Petra. I guess that's probably what everybody says. So since that's but it is a pretty amazing place. So uh, Abdul Kadir, thanks for coming from Mumbai. So where else can I watch? If you're having issues, thanks for asking, Richard. So if you are having issues on LinkedIn, and I know sometimes it can be challenging, you can also watch on YouTube. So if you look at my YouTube channel, let me add it in there real quick. So it does both at the same time. So there are some folks watching over on LinkedIn, and there's some folks on YouTube. It's probably like 50-50 right now. So let's see. Someone over on LinkedIn is asking, since many organizations will not be able to afford network monitoring, what can be done? Is it possible for local government agencies to step in and assist? And how helpful are agencies like South Carolina's Critical Infrastructure Task Force for those orgs? Oh, this is a great question, and of course, one I'm very familiar with for some folks. Yeah, I would say there's a couple things there. So yeah, it's again, most environments aren't doing network security monitoring just because of the cost. Again, they'll never have have the money. Even let's say just half of OT environments just will never have the resources financially to be able to do network security monitoring. So some people do look as a solution for the government to come in and use regulation to force them to do that. Oh, there's my dog. uh, so the problem is, of course, yeah, if the government comes in to force you to do things like network security monitoring, um, again, if those organizations just don't have the resources, so then, can the government step in, right? Um, and that's a whole different conversation, right? Especially, just speaking in the United States right now, because of the current, administration, right? Our federal government's been already shut down for what, about a month. Uh, so I think a lot of people aren't looking to the government to help solve their problems in a lot of cases. Um, I think of FEMA, so for folks that aren't aware, like the Federal Emergency Agency, right? So if a hurricane comes in, and flattens, let's say, part of a city, we just had this happen to us a year ago. FEMA at the government, at the country level, would come in and help with resources, financial backing for affected families, those types of things. The current presidential administration wants to move that to the states. I don't think a lot of states have those resources. So you do mention South Carolina. So I have a sneaking suspicion who this could or couldn't be. But yeah, so I think one thing that people don't realize is that South Carolina actually has a really strong presence from a cybersecurity perspective and critical infrastructure perspective. So Ryan and his team down there watch over, critical infrastructure. So if you're a critical infrastructure, you're a OT operator in the state and you have an issue, right? You're going to call them and they're going to be able to come and help you, in that time. A lot of states don't have those capabilities. There's also a lot. The South Carolina National Guard has a really strong cyber presence that they don't get acknowledged as much as they should. So South Carolina, as backwards as we can be in a lot of areas. Like I think we're like number 47 in education for the country. We are probably in the top five for OTICS cybersecurity. And that's a lot due to a lot of the work that Ryan Trusky and his teams do in on the SC kick critical infrastructure team. Absolutely. So yeah, we're really lucky to have them. And that guy works every minute of every day. Like uh, yeah, he's got a crazy job. So Fabrizio says, "Isn't it dangerous to do pen testing in OT environments and it could cause disruptions?" Yeah, absolutely. So it's just at a general statement, yeah, you'll never hear me say, "Oh, just do pen testing in a production environment." So test environments, thankfully, digital twin environments, right, virtualized environments are getting closer and closer to where they can start to emulate the real world, which is really, I think, in another year or two they'll really be where we need to be, where you can just pen test against a virtualized environment like yours. Um, so that'll be really cool, I think. We're not there yet, but we're getting there. But yeah, I can tell you that I know, and I would say there's probably 2 dozen actual, like, real OT ICS pen testers in the world, right? There's probably hundreds at this point doing the work, if not 1,000 or more at this point. But I would say the people that you would trust into being in your plant is probably less than a dozen or two. And I would say I probably know most of them, right? And I have these conversations. So yeah, a lot of OT pen testing is actually, it's not even an OT pen test, right? All you're doing is really IT, because you're just moving from Windows machine to Windows machine. You start out on the IT network and see if you can get into the IT OT DMZ, and that a lot of times, like 70% of the time, that's it. You're done, right? So you never touched any control system assets like PLCs or HMIs. And then another 10-15% of the time, they see, oh, can you get a foothold in the OT network from the IT side, right? And so kind of that assumed breach scenario. So 80-85% of the time, that's all you're doing, if not 90% of the time. And then there are some that they have their client sign off and say, "Hey, you can take control over like all the Windows machines," right? Because remember, a lot of OT environments, just there's Windows everywhere, and you have a typical kind of like Windows IT network in your plant. Active Directory file servers and SQL Server for data historians, etc. So some clients say, "Hey, take control over all that you can." And it's like, okay, I could see that, as long as, again, you have someone in engineering say, as long as you don't crash anything, it's not going to impact safety and operations. I'm like, okay, I can see that. And then if you take it a little bit further, then you would have somebody say, okay, can I find an HMI, right? Can I take a screenshot? What if I find a web interface for like SCADA manager interface? Can you log into that? Right. That's where I think for a lot, right, you're increasing the risk. Right? So it's hard to determine. Right. The only way to not impact safety and availability is to say we don't test in production. But I do have those conversations with a lot of folks where, again, most testing and pen testing is just Windows machines to Windows machines, and there's limited risk there, right? I'm not saying zero, but that's between the testers and the client. And then when they start getting into more, like, I know one guy, like, yeah, we find an HMI and we can log in, but they're not making any changes, right? They're not clicky clicky, right? Trying to make changes in the environment. So, but again, it really comes down to the testers and the client and what they agree to. Like I had a $500 million, basically petrochemical facility want me to do pen testing in a live environment. I was like, yeah, no, I'm sorry. A, you couldn't pay me enough. B, I don't have enough liability insurance. And just, again, it's just, if there's ever a small percentage that someone would get hurt or killed, I, no, no, want to do manufacturing in a maintenance window. That's completely different when nobody's inside the plant. So yeah, so very different. So do you think CompTIA will saturate the market with SecOT Plus and make the OT space less valuable from these? Well, so there's a couple of things to think about. So I'm really looking forward to the CompTIA SecOT Plus certification because we don't have a entry level or affordable certification, in OT ICS cybersecurity. So it's very badly needed for sure, right? Because your only options for the most part are SANS, which if you go to a class and an exam, it's $11,000 to $12,000, right? US, right? That's a ton of money. Or you can go the ISA IEC 62443 route. Even then, you have to take 4 classes and exams, right? You have to take the courses. You can't just take the exams. And those are what, about 1,600 if you pay full price, maybe a little bit more now. And so, right, even then, right, that's still, let's say 5,000, just rounding, US dollars. That's still a lot. So to be able to do something for like $400 probably max, I think is awesome, right? And you're not forced to take a class, right? And so it helps people, demonstrate their passion, basic level of knowledge. It helps people, especially coming from an IT cybersecurity background, get their foot in the OT world, right? Help them get that entry level job, which is great. Um, Regardless of CompTIA and SecOT Plus, I would say in 5, 6, 7 years, OT cybersecurity, the job market, I think it's kind of where you're going, is probably going to look like the IT job market after COVID. It is going to be flooded because you have to remember there are only so many jobs in OT ICS cybersecurity, and because there's only so many environments, right? There are IT environments everywhere, right? But from an OT perspective, right, there's only so many power plants. There's only so many water, wastewater treatment facilities. There's only so many train networks. There's only even, so many manufacturers, even though I say it right, that's manufacturing is the vast amount of, majority of OT environments out there. But again, at the end of the day, there are only so many, and there's so much smaller compared to IT. So I do think, and I could be wrong, but I think OT cybersecurity is going to be pretty flooded, job market in like 5, 6, 7 years, if that. So if it is something that you're interested in, now is the time, right? Now is the perfect time because a couple of years ago people weren't hiring, right? Because they weren't doing anything about OT cybersecurity, but now a lot of, I should say more, more are, not everybody, but more are. So more are hiring. So there are some positions out there, right, to get, right? And that number is actually increasing, which is great. And you have more people coming into the field, which is great. But it will, I think, get to a point where you have so many more people looking for those jobs, and those jobs they just won't exist. So the only other thing that might change that is if something really, really, really bad happens. And I hate saying it, and you don't want to jinx it, and you don't want to, bring it down. But yeah, something really bad happened. So kind of the stereotypical scenario, which cannot happen from a cyber attack. It's like a billion to one long shot, attacker getting into a nuclear power plant and creating a meltdown, right? It The chances of it happening are so minuscule, it never would. But let's say it did. Something like that happened, then I think everybody would be hiring for OT ICS cybersecurity, right? Because all of a sudden they would see the importance, but a lot still do not see the importance today. So, but yeah, so but CompTIA, the SecOT Plus certification is definitely needed. It's very necessary. So it'll be out in another, right, like June, July in beta next year. So which will be awesome. Um, it Yeah, it itself is not going to, flood or saturate the market, I think, but the market will definitely become saturated at some point in the future. But probably like I said, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years down the road. Complex AR says basic appears to deal with known knowns. What cybersecurity strategy or approach is used to discover and uncover unknowns in OT is used. Yeah, that's where we kind of go back to the conversation around things like network security monitoring. So, yeah, basic definitely would help with yeah. These are the basic fundamentals that we apply. It will reduce your risk the most against known knowns and unknown unknowns and everything in between. Um, but really, your fail safe to catch everything else for the vast majority is going to be network security monitoring. The only thing that's going to go around that is if you have literally somebody show up on site. Somebody shows up on site. I don't with C4 and creates an explosion. There's nothing you're going to do about that from a cybersecurity perspective. I already was talking about someone's going to get a rifle and shoot up a substation. Right? There's nothing you're going to do about that from a cybersecurity perspective. So I think that's another one where a lot of people overlook like the physical risk that we have in OT or ICS environments, even more than the IT world. So yeah, hopefully that helps answer your question. So Duncan, boy, right down the street. So New York, there's Claudia from New York City. So there's Sarah. So welcome. We just connected on LinkedIn the other day from all the way from Spain. So thanks, Eric. Appreciate it. Karthik asked, is NIDS mandatory for OT environments, especially for small package systems connected to plant technical infrastructure? And that's kind of, one of the things that we've been talking about is, just network security monitoring in general, deploying network intrusion detection sensors, right? Watching passively, not doing prevention, right? Not trying to block traffic, only watching what's in the environment and try to detect, especially things like anomalies. And then investigate those anomalies. So um, I think it's mandatory. Absolutely, it's my number one control after a firewall. And sometimes right, you can even be watching firewall traffic to use it to find malicious activity in the environment. Right, absolutely. I've found state adversaries in environments just looking at the allowed traffic in a firewall, and more importantly, the block traffic, and asking, hey, where's this block traffic coming from? Right. But yeah, is it? Do I consider it mandatory? Absolutely. But again, it goes to the point where the vast majority of environments they can't afford it, so they don't have it. Um, where it is mandatory as far as like federal regulation in the United States or North America, we have for power generation and power transmission facilities, so power plants. Um, they are now required by NERC-CIP, which is the federal regulation that oversees them, that they now have to do network security monitoring. That was just added within like the last year and a half. So it's great to see that they added it. So they are trying to continually improve NERC-CIP, even though it's a very slow process. I actually had a call yesterday with one of the 6 grid operators for the North American grid, and it was all around kind of that roadmap of improvement for NERC-CIP. So, and then they have a lot of things on the list. Number 9 on the list, which was our main focus yesterday, was talking about the need to improve the workforce, right? Because we just don't have the people out there to hire to protect the grid because they don't have the knowledge and skills. So that goes back to our earlier conversation about things like CompTIA, SecOT Plus, right? That's a great entry level secure certification to help. So oh, that's awesome. Yeah, especially if there's folks in B-Sides, or sorry, if there's folks in New York, the New York area that want to help out. Claudia's working to get a version of B-Sides ICS spun up there. We're going to have most people, if you're not familiar with B-Sides ICS, you might not even be familiar with B-Sides from the IT world, where it's really just about community events, just bringing people together. Sometimes, right, you have world thought leaders, but you also have people that are brand new to the field, and like everything in between, and just kind of bringing everybody together, mixing them up, just hanging out, making connections, right, learning, sharing. And we started B-Sides ICS this year in February. So I was really excited to do that. And then this coming in 2026, right now we have 6 events already on the schedule around the world. So there's 2 in Australia, there's 1 in Singapore, we have Miami in February, we have Belgium. We have Bristol out in London, essentially. So, yeah, I'm really excited. So it'd be great to have New York City on the list as well. Plus, it's a much shorter commute for me. So, um, so yeah, I appreciate. Yeah, Claudia mentioned that. So, but if you want more information, you can check out bsidesics.org, and then that's actually just a right now it just points to our Miami event, but it's going to get switched over to also list all of the other events as well that are coming up. So really excited. Let's see. Shane asked, is there a policy in place when Modbus won't be encrypted? So there are versions of a lot of OT protocols that today are not encrypted. They're also not authenticated, right? So you could connect to those devices with usernames or without usernames and passwords and run commands. So there are versions that are evolving that have encryption, that have authentication. You just have to remember it's while those are becoming more secure, there are challenges in those environments. So doing things like certificates. I'm thinking especially like Ethernet IP and SIP security profiles. It's another industrial control protocol, mostly like you would see them on like Rockwell PLCs. So you could do things like encryption, but then of course you have to have the digital certificates to do the encryption, and that that takes management, right? That takes time and resources. So there are definitely some challenges when working with those newer versions of encrypted and authenticated protocols. So they're slow to evolve, though, and I don't. Plants today are still not going to implement most of those for sure. So but it's a good question. So I think it's going to be a slow process to get there. And again, the like the plans that exist today, it's not like they're going to come back in 5 years and say, okay, let's deploy like encrypted versions of those protocols. I would more than likely. So um, is there any problem to install Splunk Forwarder in OT servers? No, if you want, I mean, I would think you're really mostly referring to like the Windows-based servers, especially that sit in OT and sending those events to like a SIM Splunk, whether it's in OT or it sits in IT. No, not at all. You just want to make sure if you're sending, especially from OT to IT, that communication is one way, right? And you're not allowing any communication to come back from the IT network. And the nice thing is when you're doing event forwarding, right, it's literally like usually UDP, like syslog traffic, right? You're just sending it in one direction, and you can write the firewall rule to allow that, and you don't have to worry about allowing an attacker in from IT potentially. So yeah, no, it's a great question, Ollie. Hopefully that answers it. Mohammed asked, do we need to scope the SIS network for security monitoring as it is isolated from process control network with one way or no communicate? It should be, right? And so what Mohammed is talking about and we mentioned like with the Trisis incident that, right, we have the safety instrumented system, which are just other controllers. They're just focused on safety, right? Ensuring safety, shutting down the environment. There's some other things that they do, but it's really about shutting things down. If there's ever we get to a condition where something really bad is going to happen, like an explosion, right? So those should be completely segregated off, right? They should be on their own isolated network. Period. The end. now. I think kind of where Mohammed is going. In the Tricis incident, they weren't segregated, right? They were just wide open, on the OT network, and that's how the attackers were able to get to them, and upload malicious firmware. So, um, so let's say they are properly segmented off, right? Then you say, well, I do want to get the events from the SIS, from the safety controllers, to my SIM, right, for monitoring, right? Which is great. I think that's completely valid request. So in this case, right, you have your safety controllers in that safety zone, that segmented network, and then you can use a data diode, right, between the safety zone and the rest of the network. So that allows you to send traffic in one direction, right? And it physically, right, uses physics inside the data diode, so you can never actually have return traffic. So it only allows traffic in one direction. So yeah, if I would ever allow outbound traffic from the SIS or the safety zone for monitoring purposes, I would do it with a data diode. Yeah, that would be the only time. So, but yeah. So, um, let's see. So I was just trying to look for questions. Thomas asked, as an automation engineer with more than 24 years of experience, what's the best route into OT cybersecurity? Oh, that's a great question. Let me put in the. Oh, I don't know if I have it on this machine. Oh, I don't. But what I can do is, if you go to my website and go to mikeholcomb.com, and there, go onto the resources tab, and then you look for the ebook. So there's two free ebooks. One is for people from an IT background, and then one is for people with an engineering or an OT automation background like yourself. And so it talks about, here's the 10 steps you can go through. So I come from an IT cybersecurity background, right, in 35 plus years. But in my day job, I work with 4,000 control system and electrical engineers. Um, so I don't have an engineering background. I'm still kind of working on my engineering knowledge, but I think I have a fair idea of what to do. So yeah, check that definitely check that out. So hopefully that helps. Kevin asked, when AI energy demand, there's going to be an increase in power plants being built or reopened. Yeah, we see that. Um, and when I say, oh, that's funny, you can actually add that. Oh, that's kind of cool. Just by clicking. Yeah, oh, that's cool. Yeah, and I'm not speaking for my day job, but I do work for one of the world's largest engineering and construction companies. I'm friends now with some of the top, like, grid, experts in North America, and I don't see how it's going to happen, honestly. Just the vast amount of demand for energy. And yeah, there's people talking about, yes, we're going to reopen these, like, old nuke plants, and we're going to build all these energy. There's not enough people to build all the plants that they're talking about building. There just isn't, right? Or we're just going to build a bunch of small modular nuclear reactors. I'm like, that. Sure, those are starting to get there, but it's going to be a couple years still. So before you see those popping up, people are like, "Oh, we can do solar and wind." I'm like, "That's great, but it takes time to build those things as well." So it's a really interesting time. I'm really jealous of, like, countries like China, where they have, just vast amounts of, they have extra power, right? Because they've been building out that infrastructure for so long, including solar and wind. Like in North America, we're way behind the curve. But I do talk a lot about that, especially just because, yeah, when you think of bringing more plants online, there's just more, targets from an OT, ICS, cybersecurity perspective. Yeah, for sure. Farron asks, see if it. When will you think the ramp up will happen? I see JP Morgan is investing a lot into, per se, important infrastructure. Yeah, again, it's, especially if we're talking about energy infrastructure. I think at this point, right, the money's there, right? Because you have the Metas and the Microsofts and the others of the world. Um, but at the end of the day, again, the thing is, they want to build all these huge, massive facilities, and there's only like 10 companies in the world that can actually build those facilities. And then you look at, data centers, right, where, like Microsoft went to train and they bought out all of their air conditioning units for like the next 3 years, right? So you can't even go and buy air conditioning units for your data centers, right? Or you can't buy the turbines that you need for your power plants. So yeah, I just people think it's just going to automatically appear, let alone the grid just isn't able to handle that much power. It's just not, and that takes a lot of careful coordination, which yeah isn't going to happen. Yeah, so it's really interesting to see. So Gotech says, yeah, even with renewable energy, yeah, renewable energy is awesome, right? But right, we can only most of that's generated during the day because of solar. Now, of course, put that in just huge, massive battery arrays, and then you can have it trickle out throughout the night. Great, awesome. But again, it's more stuff that um, you have to manage. So I was just talking with an engineer the other day. They actually had to shut down the big solar farm outside of Las Vegas because it wasn't doing its job. And here's it sounded like it's more of a problem with dust covering the panels, and then having to do all the maintenance, and it just became where it wasn't worth it, which it's really, really sad to see because again, especially like, and I'm not super familiar with a lot of other countries, but in the U.S., we're so far behind on renewables, and the ones that we do have, right, do make a difference, right? But so to see a large project like that shut down is sad. So I know we're just a little bit over time, so I'll take another question or two, and then we'll kind of wrap up. But hopefully, again, we'll see everybody back. Again, trying to do noons on Tuesdays. I am doing a speaking at the ICS conference next week in Atlanta, though. So at 11:30 to 12:30, so I won't be able to do noon. But so Purna asked, what metrics indicators do you find most meaningful in OT cybersecurity? That's great. Great question. And then usually in IT, we often use SOCs and SIMs for monitoring. What's your view on integrating OT telemetry into enterprise SOC? Yeah, yeah, that's so the metrics and indicators question. That's always kind of a tricky one because there are some, like in IT, right? There's a lot of standard metrics that you can look at. Um, the golden rule for me is the use the metrics that the leadership are going to look at to get the resources that you need to get the job done. And then there's also, yes, the metrics we need for ourselves, like the people actually doing the job, to make sure everything stays secure. And some of that does come from SOC SIM. So I'm a huge fan of OT SOCs. Um, it goes back to there's not many because it's kind of plugged into the network security monitoring conversation, right? Not a lot of people are doing network security monitoring because of those costs, right? If you add in a SOC, right, then you're only getting that, or a SIM, it's only that much more expensive. Plus, what if you're building your own SOC or you're bringing in an MSP? Because you do see OT MSSPs are starting to evolve more these days, even though have to be realistic. It's mostly staffed by IT cybersecurity pros that don't understand the OT world yet. I'm not saying they won't get there, right? It just takes time. So, but in a perfect world, if it was me running an organization and a plant, I would have an OT SOC that was just the OT events. And I would also forward them to the IT side. Because if I'm true SIM, right? The whole idea behind SIM is you see the whole big picture, right? So I want my OT team to focus on just OT, right? Because and they're going to understand those events. Because I'll tell you, if you bring somebody, and I was like this, right? If you bring, and probably still today, right? If you're someone like myself from an IT background, and you start looking at OT events, you'll be like, oh, that's an attack, that's an attack, that's an attack, that's an attack, and it's not, right? Because it's just it really is a whole different world from that perspective. So. But yeah, so hopefully that answers your question. So yeah, yes to OT SOC dedicated, and then yeah, forward those events to the IT side. So on the IT side, right, you see everything IT and OT put together, right? That's the whole point of SIM, is being able to see the big picture. So yeah. So, and then speaking about monitoring, what is your suggestion about connecting the SOC with the work? Oh, I think we just kind of covered that. So, yeah, as far as the auditing process, then it's a little different. But so if you're like an ISO shop, you can apply those principles to the OT world, but in OT or ICS, that's where we look to not like ISO 27001, 27002, but we look to ISA, IEC 62443, right? So, and that helps us, it just helps us understand, right? IT and OT are very different. You know, some people will tell you they're nothing alike, which is total BS. I hate when people say that because they have more in common than they don't, right? But right, that the idea at the end of the day is they still are different, and there are some areas where they are very different. And if you don't treat them very different, you could get somebody hurt or you could get somebody killed, right? Which obviously we wouldn't want to have happen. So, and then I'll have to look to see. Yeah, if are you coming to the disc event at Dragos next month? No. I wish I've completely obliterated my travel budget for this year. So I have to be a good boy and not have to play within the budget. I just had so many trips this year. And so having Dragos in November, it's like my travel budget was gone in July, and I'm already having to pay for my trip to Atlanta next week. Like that's a whole week. But so and I would love to come with Dragos. So I have so many friends that were there. So it's always good to see everybody that's there. So and it was I didn't go last year, but I was there the year before, and it was really great show. So but I definitely fear of missing out on that one for sure. So but I still like in the back of my brain try to think of a way to make it happen. So but anyways, so I know we're over, but I appreciate everybody for joining. So again, hopefully we'll see everybody on Tuesdays at noon. Again, I'll be out for a conference, speaking at the Security Week ICS conference in Atlanta next week. So it's one of the bigger ICSOT cybersecurity conferences out there. So if anybody's in the Atlanta area, definitely say hello. If you're at the conference, definitely come by. I'm also doing a free pen test, OT pen test workshop on that Thursday for I think it's like six hours. So it's like 3 hours before lunch, 3 hours afterwards. So, but hopefully I'll see some folks down there. But don't forget, yeah, you can always reach out on LinkedIn. Of course, we mentioned the content on YouTube as well, where some folks are watching. So yeah, I appreciate everybody for coming out though, and all the great questions. And yeah, hopefully I'll see you at another session soon. So thanks again, everybody. Take care.